All right, with the recording going, allow me to begin by welcoming you all and taking time out of your busy days to spend a little bit of time in learning with us. And I appreciate this opportunity to be able to talk to you about these subjects, which I feel are near and dear and give us a rope to cling to in sometimes what we would say are desperate times. Um, but with that said, let me take a look at this question that's been posted here by Robert. Should we be thinking about Sufism as a separate group within Islam, like Shia or Sunni, or should we think of it as a path, more of an esoteric expression, regardless if one is Shia or Sunni? Thank you for the question, Robert. It is, at its heart, a rather difficult question because might have to ask ourselves at the very beginning, what is the purpose of classification, right? Like who benefits from these systems of classification and why do they exist perhaps at all? And on some level, there may be a desire for these groups to differentiate themselves. So, for example, when we're talking about Sunni and Shia, for a large chunk of the early period, we're going to have to talk about Proto Shia, because at the earliest stage, it was not clear that the Shia had emerged as a distinct unit, as a distinct peoples, as such. They had not yet cultivated a distinct theology, a distinct approach to text, a reorganization of the hadith around the character of the imams. So the question is difficult because, on the one hand, the Sunni and Shia split um, tends to be read backwards from the era of the nation state into the past. So today, we have very high walls erected around these identities, and then it's tied to also uh, the 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 type of the kind of religiosity of the nation state. Let me give you an example. So let's talk about the conflict between um, Saudi Arabia, for example, and Iran. So Saudi Arabia purports to be the representative of Sunni Islam, sometimes mistakenly called Orthodox Islam, right? Orthodox is a term that's not really appropriate for Islam. But in the case of the Sunni, they are allied with the state, or the so-called Salafis in Saudi Arabia are allied with the state, making it effectively a Sunni state, whereas Iran is tends towards the Shia expression. And because it has raised to the level now of a national project, this will mean it'll impact the way that students in school learn about Sunni and Shia, and often tied with this nationalist gloss. In addition, how to make meaning of things like the death of a martyr, for example, or the death of a soldier. How do we make meaning of something that's senseless like that? In addition, the nation state, because religion is now going to be an aspect that it's going to be educating with on the nation state level, it's going to promote an over entanglement, perhaps, of religion and governance, which wasn't really contemplated in the early tradition. There was always a sense that the function of government required a certain amount of secularism, whereas religion could be very critical of how government functioned. This is a longabout way of saying, perhaps, that the rigidity of these identities of Sunni and Shia are more a manifestation of our modern anxieties relating to identity than anything perhaps real in the past. So then what is this question of Sufism? How exactly does it fit? My suggestion would be to think of Sufism as not something that is exclusive, i.e., that when you join Sufism, you cease to be a Sunni or you would cease to be a Shia. But Sufism borrows more liberally from any tradition in which it finds its resonance, than either the Sunni or the Shia might be comfortable with on its own. So someone who's a Sunni who joins a Sufi lodge may have a much broader understanding and approach to the tradition, including reading perhaps Jafar Sadiq's Quran interpretation, one of the most mystical interpretations of the Quran. So that they would be Sunni, but they would be reading a Shia Imam's commentary on the Quran and reading the poetry of Rumi, for example. So, my suggestion is often that Sufism can't be thought of as an ism in the same way today that we might think of something like Hinduism, but rather, Sufism is a philosophical, emotional, and devotional dedication that when someone perhaps is dissatisfied with the tension in the Quranic text of eternity, the promise of mercy and love, while contrasting it with the manifestation of positive law in the world that's derived from religion, which is going to require the cutting off of hands, perhaps the flagellation of people in the marketplace. And so when you're faced with the sense that Islam is being used to authorize brutality in your that you might be seeing in the public square, and at the same time, Islam is speaking of love, mercy, majesty, infinity in the Quran. How do you reconcile these two? And so one of the approaches might be a shift away from the world of laws to the world of love. Might be one way that you do it. And when we're talking about love in the Islamic tradition, as you know, were we to talk about love in broad traditions, we're not referring to this kind of Hollywood pastiche of modern love, right? The idea that the person that you like the Romeo and Juliet kind of romantic love, right? It's less that. Love in the tradition is something that seems to be the breath of life itself is love. God loved, therefore the universe exists. That kind of approach. The approach that's bedded in the Hadith Qudsi that we've discussed a few times this semester, and which we will spend a little time with today as well. The idea that the God is claiming that I loved to be known, and the desire of the servant then define the object of their love. And it's not incidental that the love traditions are not going to be exclusive, because if the love traditions are about the experience, about chasing the ephemera, the encounter with the divine, and so the feeling of love could come through even Hinduism. It could come through Zoroastrianism, which is maybe why when the poet goes to his tavern and has the young, beautiful Zoroastrian boy pouring his wine, it wouldn't be blasphemy for this Sufi poet to think that the Zoroastrian boy who's pouring his wine is also an image of the divine made manifest, right? This is a little bit it's a little bit difficult to understand because it crosses so many boundaries. But remember, the existence of those boundaries are the politics of knowledge and the control of knowledge being manifested for polemical ends, right? Carving out the what constitutes Sunnism, what constitutes legitimate Islam. These are the kinds of obsessions of people who want to control, and the Sufis so frequently are not interested in control, but in letting go of control, right? So if the instinct is the opposite, if the instinct to categorize and formalize is the instinct that flows, that makes Sunni and Shia, the Sufi rejects perhaps both to say that rather the what I'm chasing is the feeling, the emotion, the encounter, and that can be sought anywhere, right? So it's a very long answer, Robert, but I hope you're getting the sense that as I'm agonizing to try and give you a response, that the answer isn't a good one. That the doors of Sufism are kind of open because it itself is an argument. When we claim that somebody is a Sufi poet, We're asserting an argument about that person. They may not even themselves have identified as a Sufi poet. So, for example, Abu Nuwas, a famous poet who was alive at the time of the Prophet, um, writes these bawdy rhymes, very homoerotic about the bathhouse, and we'll actually pull up one in a little bit. But Abu Nawaz is not a Sufi, right? He's writing in an environment in which he is deeply critical of uh, of of this kind of religiosity, um, but the Sufis find in him a resonance, which they then explode into thinking of him then as a Sufi as well. And it's the Sufis finding the resonance in it, and not him writing for a Sufi audience, if that makes sense. Um, Peyton, I'm going to have a discussion about the bookkeeping or housekeeping, about how to come up with a thesis. And it's just as to quick and dirty to ease your nerves. I'm not so much looking for a fully developed thesis as I would like you to have picked who you're going to be looking at for your longer paper by tomorrow. And it's just a kind of nudge, nudge to let's get going on that. And I'll spend the last sort of 15 to 20 minutes of class talking about it, so we're all on the same page. I just want you to have thought about which religious figure you're going to look into. All right. And you're going to have attempts, you're going to have opportunities after proposing the topic to then submit an annotated bibliography, which I will help you with as well. And then finally, we'll move into writing the paper itself. All right. So please don't stress about what's due tomorrow. It's pretty straightforward. In addition, I will also be handing out grades with regards to the first assignment within the week as well. All right. Wonderful. Back to our topic. Today, we're talking a bit about Sufi poetry, and we're going to be engaging Sufi poetic forms. And again, this is a difficult, a very very difficult area for us to engage in English. One of the reasons is that there's this Italian saying tradute de trattore. Like to translate is to betray, or to be a traitor to the original. And I want to resist this tendency to just want to throw all translation out, because if we are talking about the beauty of Sufi poetry, you're going to find exquisite poetry in English, in Spanish, in Arabic, in Persian, in Urdu, in Farsi, in all of these different varieties of Sufi encounters are not going to be exclusive to one or the other. Even the expansion of Sufi poetry into the vernacular was something that was heavily debated. But the advantage of the vernacular is that it is targeting a different audience, right? Like even the translation of Sufism and Sufi poetry into English is the desire to reach a new audience today. So Rumi is just simply not accessible to a majority of people, for example, living in the United States and Canada, if he is not being translated. And there are some very good translations available out there now. But then the question is, how do you translate? Do you translate into poetry? So Coleman Barks, for example, very famous translator or a very famous poet who's worked with translators to render Rumi into the English. One of the sins of Coleman Barks, though, is he bleaches the Islam out of Rumi. He flattens the landscape which Rumi is engaging with. And this was raised in particular by Dr. Omid Safi. He wrote an article and a series of articles about how Islam gets divorced from the traditions of Sufi poetry in translation. So perhaps that is one of the great sins of translation, is that it removes the context entirely. which is not to say that these poems or poets only speak to a particular context, but rather it deepens our understanding of the poetry when we allow it to resonate with our knowledge of the Quran. Again, Omid Safi once referred to this as trying to read Milton without ever having read the Bible, right? It just wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense for you to read Rumi without ever having encountered the Quran. You just wouldn't get the references. You wouldn't understand the power of what Rumi is trying to convey, or the inversions that he's involved in if you don't want to put the two together and allow them to resonate. All right. So this question of translation is a tough one, but at the same time, Rumi is widely considered one of the best read poets in the United States. So he's one of the greatest selling poets there. So can it be simultaneously that translation is a betrayal, but his work has just exploded in terms of who and who's reading it and encountering it only after the translation, right? So we'll discuss this a little bit as well. All right, let's get into the meat of it. In the background here, you have a performance of poetry taking place in a garden on this beautiful mosaic tile. And here you're going to see some of the other uh, indicators of these kind of these cultural forms influencing each other, because poetry is never going to be separate from calligraphy, is never going to be separate from the sama or the music that would accompany the poetry, would never be separate from the oral performance of the poetry. So the poetry is not simply read in Protestant fashion silently in one's own home, right? It's performed, it's heard, it's encountered. And so this is what we're seeing in this little bit of tile work in the background here. Um, let's begin with this point because we have a tendency in every class to start with the Quran. So let's begin with the Quran again today. And the Quran and Muslims in general, in the very early tradition, have somewhat of an uneasy relationship with poetry, because poetry was conceived of at the time of Muhammad as being part of, is being like magic, that you could perform a sort of word magic with poetry, and poets were lauded and reviled depending on which side of them you were on. So, a poet, for example, could turn the tide of a battle with a great poem designed to eviscerate the enemy. In fact, Muhammad's opponents in Mecca, when he retreats to Yathrib or Medina, include poets who are slandering him in Mecca. The other thing is that the Quran is in a sort of a poetic form, especially if you were to look at the surahs from the first 10-year period, 10 or 12-year period, when Muhammad is in Mecca. You can find these most easily by flipping to going in sort of in reverse order in your Quran. The shorter verses at the end are the ones that would have emerged earliest, but those verses often have a rhyming sense that the last words of the phrase may rhyme, and it sounds quite poetic. And even when rendered through recitation, you can hear the sort of poetry of the words. But does that render the Quran poetry? Is the Quran poetry? Now, there is a reticence about this in the Quran itself. So, for example, um, in Surah 36:69, it in speaking about Muhammad, it indicates, and we have not taught him poetry, nor would it befit him. And the reason being is that the Quran is arguing that the Prophet is not like these word magicians that you are already used to. the kinds of poets that you would be encountering in the region, that's not what this guy is like. So the Quran is defending the Prophet from a charge that he is merely a poet that is producing an exquisite bit of poetry. In addition, the Quran is going to defend him from madness. It's going to say he is not mad either. He's not mad and he's not a poet. These are the two things that the Quran is going to set up as a defense of the Prophet. The other thing is poetry, the argument might be, is something that is created by humans, whereas the divine is dealing with revelation, is not dealing with us adjusting the words of the language to fit a particular mood, but rather revelation is something that is kind of unaltered. It's not planned out in the way that a poet would adjust and play with a word to get it to rhyme in the right way, right? Like that's not the way that the Quran emerges. In the Muslim accounts of the Quran, it emerges, on the tablet of eternity in the heavens. It's delivered by the angel Gabriel, and it arrives written on the heart of the Prophet and then is recited out, right? That's not the same process by which we produce poetry, because poetry has the agency of the human agent in this case. And the problem with that agency is it would be a threat to the authority of the Prophet, right? Um, the other thing is that the Quran talks a lot about the love traditions which poets themselves will draw upon. So, on the one hand, the Quran is not poetry and Muhammad is not understood to be a poet. But on the other hand, poets are going to draw very deeply from the love traditions contained within the Quran. So, for example, in Surah 554, God will bring a people whom he loves and who love him, which is often shortened in poetic form when you see it in a poem. He loves them, they love him. It seems like here the relationship between the creator and the created is a relationship of love. And in fact, when we're talking about the nature of God in the Quran, it is the emphasis on God's love which is perhaps the most common indication of our relationship to God as described in the Quran. God is merciful, again, a trait which would be manifest from love, right? So the idea of all of these traits which highlight the love of God for the creation uh, is perhaps the most dominant sense we would get of God from reading the Quran closely. This is also expanded on in the Hadith, which this often in poetry, love and beauty are put side by side. So, for example, God is beautiful and He loves beauty, which comes from the surah collections, sorry, the Hadith collections of Muslim. In addition, you're going to find the praise of beauty being one of the most common themes in Sufi poetry. The idea that if God loves beautiful things, now this could be a beautiful person, this could be a beautiful camel, this could be a beautiful plant. Any beauty is a reflection of the beauty that God loves, right? So if God loves a thing for it is beautiful, to appreciate something beautiful is to put it into resonance with the divine. The other thing that's kind of important to understand here is that Leonard Lewison talked about this recently. Lewisham, sorry. He discusses how ugliness is not the opposite of beauty, it is the deprivation of beauty. So something is ugly because it is a perceptual misconception by the looker. So something seems ugly to us because we're looking at it perhaps in the wrong way, or that beauty has been deprived from that thing. So, for example, if we're going to talk about an ugly situation, like say the storming of the Capitol, right, in the United States, let's take a very mundane example, an ugly situation. That would be because the poet may argue is the deprivation of love within the nation, that the nation has been built in terms of scarcity of resources, limited and limited identities in which we're all shoring up our soldiers to try and define ourselves against the interests of others. And this inevitably leads to conflict, as opposed to the path of love, which maybe recognizes the dignity of each other, the right to live, the right to thrive, and the right to exist in freedom in this world. So, capitalism, for example, orders time in terms of money. Time is money is the phrase, right? So if time is money, what time are you willing to spend on contemplation? What time are you willing to spend in prayer or in love or in thought, right? This becomes something that's very expensive, and it's only something that can be afforded during limited times in our lives. So we tell our students simultaneously that you need to make time for contemplation and thought, and yet force them to work while they're in university, right? So how does that work? Where are they meant to take this time to contemplate, to think? I realize that many of you might be in that situation right now, and the difference might be in a state like in Denmark, sorry, in the Netherlands. My understanding is that they pay a stipend to students from the government while they're in school, because the idea is that they should not have to do this commercial ordering of time at the same time in which they're being required to be contemplative, to be thinking, to be engaged. How can we not make that possible at the same time? Or how can I convince students to study something like Sufi poetry, or the different systems of the religion of love, when the world is so brutal to them at the same time? Like, who would choose to incur a ton of debt to study beauty, right? Like, that seems like it seems we've set up and created an impossible situation at the present. So Lewisham understands this idea that ugliness is going to be the deprivation of beauty, that we don't allow beauty to exist there, and that's how a thing becomes ugly, right? As opposed to it is ugly on its face, its nature is ugly. This is a similar argument to evil, right? So evil is not itself an existent separate force, but it is the deprivation of good. To kind of play with Hannah Arendt's definition there. In addition, Ibn Arabi's thought is going to play with this. He's going to describe in Surah 40:64 that God's relationship is He formed you and made beautiful your forms. So beauty here is going to be discussed in terms of that God is beauty, that God loves beauty, and therefore God loves God. And if we, like Ibn Arabi describes us, are mirrors of the divine, are perfectly trying to reflect that divine beauty, the polishing of the mirror, the erasing of the ego, the cultivation of the self to be better, these are the necessary things that we must do to cultivate a closer relationship with the divine, right? To erase our worldly desires, the things, the ways that we do, how we engage in this deprivation of beauty by being forced to work a meaningless job, or to be in a loveless relationship, right? These are the kinds of things which we are saying we need to polish away. Let's move on to our next slide. This is again the standard stuff that we've been raising all semester. How do we know what we know? One of the things that we had just commented on slightly earlier was the nature of translation. So here's an example which is going to invert the one I gave earlier. So when I mentioned that translation in some cases is to betray, alternatively, translation could give new life, could make something new. And this is often the case, well, this has been the case with Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam was a relatively unknown poet. He was known better for being a thinker, sort of philosophically minded thinker. And again, when we use the word philosophy with reference to the history of Islam, more often we're going to be talking about people who were engaging with the Hellenic traditions, right? So he is better known as having come out of those traditions, which may not surprise us then in the 19th century when there's this resurgence in classicism, when there's this desire to look to the Greeks to study Plutarch, to study Homer, to study Plato, and what have you. When there's this heightened sense of this material, that the scholars themselves or the translators would look for resonant figures in the Islamic past. And so they discovered Omar Khayyam. But Omar Khayyam was not known for being a poet in the way that Rumi or Hafiz or any others were known, but he had these fragmentary verses attributed to him. And Edward Fitzgerald, in his translation of 1859, assembles these disparate verses and applies an extraordinary poetic gloss when he translates it into English. In essence, making Khayyam something very different than the way that he may have existed within his context, also elevating him beyond the other sort of translations that were available. So in the 19th century, Omar Khayyam becomes one of the most popular poets in Europe, despite the fact that Shams Tabriz and all of these other luminaries, Ghazali and others, were quite critical of Khayyam, especially his kind of involvement with philosophy was where they were critical of him in particular. But his rubaiyat and rubaiya is going to come from arba in Arabic is four, and so it's the verse of four. The Rubaiya of Fitzgerald, the translation of Khayyam makes him something new, but also attaches him to the ethics of the period. So, with the advent of Darwinism, with the Enlightenment thinking, Khayyam suddenly gets lifted out of his context in 11th century and sort of molded onto the 19th century. So this is one of the dangers of translation, or perhaps the potentials of translation, is it can render something that doesn't quite fit in its time and in its moment into something that can become quite powerful for the present. But what it was also used in the kind of imperial consciousness of the English and of the British, the idea was that these poetic exhortations to drunkenness indicated a certain frailty in Islamic lands, right? That Islamic lands were overly sensual, overly erotic, corrupt, but often they were taking poetics to be anthropological accounts, right? And that is going to become a big problem if you see poetry for being the reality as opposed to a refraction of the real. All right. Um, and also, Khayyam raises for us this question of who gets to be a Sufi poet. So he himself, it would have been unlikely that he would have claimed that mantle, but the themes in his text fit with the themes in Sufi poetry more generally. So, is he or isn't he? Again, this question of classification and how we build the boundaries around the thing we're trying to classify, and whether or not the construction of those boundaries itself might do a certain violence to the way that that tradition operates. And that's something that should be in our minds if we're going to especially resist the imperial impulses of knowledge acquisition, right? Um, Now, this is just something that we have discussed a few times this semester, the nature of the Hadith Qudsi. And it's important, I think, when we talk about poetry, to begin with these two Hadith Qudsi, which are most famous, which show up a lot in poetry and have had a lot of impact on how these poetics have worked. This, just to recall for those of you, is the slide that shows the defense of the Hadith Qudsi as a source of knowledge. So again, just as a to reiterate, Hadith Qudsi often don't make it into the general collections of Hadith by scholars such as Bukhari or Muslim or others, but often exist broadly in the tradition. And the two Hadith Qudsi that we're going to discuss now were very, very popular at some point between the 11th and 13th centuries. They enter into the broader canon and are just there from then on, right? And the two Hadith Qudsi in particular here are that of the hidden treasure, here translated by Omid Safi. I was a hidden treasure, and I yearned and I loved to be known intimately, so I created the heavens and the earth so that they may know me intimately. And this other hadith Qudsi here, and sorry, the first one describes the nature of the relationship between God and the seeker, and the idea that there's this treasure that is hidden, that has intent, that radiates this intent to be known, and that the Sufi or the mystic is the one who can detect that intent and then chases it to its source. Alternatively, here, these are the reference to the supererogatory acts, which is often how one describes the like falling deeply into the well of love. Here it describes as my servant draws near to me through nothing. I love more than religious duty. I require of him. Sorry, so things like prayer. My servant continues to draw near to me by supererogatory worship until I love him. And when I love him, I become the ear by which he hears, the eye by which he sees, the hand by which he grasps, and the foot by which he walks. If he asks me for something, I give it to him. If he seeks protection, I provide it to him. For many Sufis, this operates as the template for the encounter that we are seeking, right? That we are trying to annihilate the ego and the self and the nafs, the, the, the sense of self, into God, into the divine. And so here is the description of that. And Sufis would point to verses like, I am nearer to man than his jugular vein from the Quran, to say that there is this intimacy of contact between the divine and the creation. So let's now take a quick step back. So we've given ourselves a little bit of the groundwork. We've got the Hadith Qudsi, we've got the kind of Quranic explanation for the where these Sufis are going to draw some inspiration. And now let's talk a bit about the kinds of things that are going to show up a lot in these poems. The first thing to be sensitive to is alchemy. Alchemy is going to show up a great deal, and because you have to keep in mind that for um, a lot of this understanding of the broad realms of knowledge, different types of knowledge, philosophical knowledge, emotional knowledge, kind of religious knowledge, are going to be thought of all leading to the same ultimate conclusion through the to the path of love. The madhab-e-ishq is the idea. And alchemy is one of the kind of sciences. And alchemy, for those of us who read history, we know that alchemy was searching for elixirs. One of them was the love potion, the idea that if you drink it, people around you would fall in love. Another was the potion that could grant eternal life. Another is the ability to change, to transmutation, to change the state of things, from changing an object into gold, for example. So alchemy is concerned with these shifts in phase. And for the Sufis, the alchemy of the heart is love. To think that the person can be transformed. So a king can be made humble, can be turned into a blathering idiot who is so deeply in love with a slave girl, as this is the going to be the second story in the Matnavi, is going to be a king who's so madly in love that he is humbled and brought low, right? So love is the thing that made that thing, that the haughty or great or separate or aloof king, into someone who's intimate and low and on the level of even a so-called slave girl here, right? The it's like an alchemical reaction that made that possible. It's the thought that how could we turn hate, something that's so intense and powerful and consuming, into love? It's like the process of alchemy, is often how that idea is going to be described in Sufi poetry. Um, Secondly, the beloved in poems, when we're going to read them, is often going to be Allah or God, um, which is going to be the beloved that is sought, the his hidden treasure, right? That is radiating the desire to be found. Black hair is going to be something that's going to show up a lot of in a lot of these poems, and this could be a reference to the Hodis, the kind of black-haired, black-eyed maidens, or kind of a substrata of angelic figure, perhaps, which are meant to be in the heavens. But also, black hair will be a way of describing the path of the seeker seeking the essence of the divine. And often indicators to this will be in descriptions of young men in the tavern, or the pourer of the cup of wine. Candles will frequently be featured because, as we mentioned previously, light is going to show up a lot in these sort of verses. One of the 99 names of God deals with light, and the light of God is going to be something that's going to show up a lot in this kind of poetics, perhaps even borrowing slightly from the Shia traditions of the ideas that the Imams are a form of divine light. And this would be the light that illuminates the heart of faith, but also represents the transferal of knowledge through the chain in the Sufi silsila. So in the Sufi order, the idea that the candle lights the next one down, and so on. Ecstasy or behudi is going to be no self or annihilation, sometimes called fana, and this is the erasure of the self in the divine. If we remember the hadith we saw a couple of slides ago, the idea is God becomes the ear, the hand, the foot, etc. So the person loses their self in the divine. In addition, a lot of these poems are going to have drunkenness be a common theme, or must, the state of ecstasy, often described in the sort of vulgar form of drink, being actually drunk, but in mystical states, the drunkenness is the experience of the encounter of the divine, or that's the response of the imperfect, cracked vessel to encounter the divine, the infinite, the deep sea, right? The falcon, which we will see, will show up a lot, which will be a representation of the rational faculties or the intellect. The heart, the qalb, will be where divine secrets are held. And so the secrets are etched on the heart. And again, this plays a little bit with the prophetic revelation and the idea that Muhammad is reciting off the pages on his heart. This is going to make this imagery very potent. The nafs is going to be the ego or the self, and this is also going to be described often in terms of the lower self. Again, the influence of uh, Greek thought, and again, I'm not even to say that it necessarily only belonged to the Greeks, but it's just who we tend to attribute it to. The idea of the classification and systems of knowledge, right? So the lowest form of the self is the ego, and Freud will add to this the super ego and the id, right? So, but for the Sufi psychoanalytical approach, is that the nafs is the kind of lower self. Nafas is the breath, possibly a reference to the breath of life in creation. So the idea that God breathes life into Adam with the sound hu, and that's what recreated sometimes in Sufi zikr as well. The hu that is meant to flow out of the solar plexus. And also, it refers to the breathing practices of Sufi orders as well, the regulation of breathing as a meditative act. And frequently, these poems are going to talk about the wine bearer. Often, the wine bearer will be a non Muslim just to make it less problematic on its face, such as a Christian or a Hindu or a Zoroastrian. But also, sometimes the wine bearer is used as an example of the master, as the spiritual master, or God. Um, and just one other thing that's kind of significant is you'll find in a lot of Sufi poetry, there's going to be garden imagery as well. And the garden imagery, number one, is because the descriptions of heaven often found in the Quranic verses are going to be descriptions of a very lush garden, which would make a lot of sense, right? If a religion is being revealed to a desert people, the opposite of this worldly desert, dry, arid, would be a lush, verdant, and moist paradise. Um, and the gardens often that are very, very popular, like if you look in the Muslim world, especially in places like Iran and in Pakistan, Afghanistan, the elites would have these exquisitely crafted gardens. And the idea of having a very carefully manicured garden or a very carefully constructed garden uh, would be to be a mirror of the divine garden on the one hand, but also it's a philosophical space because the Quran exhorts us to seek the answers in the signs of nature, in the ayah that are contained within nature. So the study of nature and the contemplation of nature is something very important to cultivation of the self. Something that we often lose, especially in the modern period, is that we don't have the opportunity to do things like that. It is a contemplative thing to do, to go and walk alone in nature. It's very powerful, especially if you do it with the words of the mystics in your mind. All right. And sorry, to the garden. Often you'll have God or the beloved being described as something like the rose, right? So, there was a Mir Taki Mir has the line "Patta patta buta buta sare baag mein to jani hai, jane na jani, gul hi na jani, hal hamara jani hai." That like every leaf, every plant knows what state I am in and knows the agony that I am in, all except for the rose. The rose does not know my state. And so it's this intense agony and the pain of separation and the desire for union in a verse like that. The other thing that's important about poetry is poetry, just like the Quran, is an experience, right? The Quran is different if you are reading it again alone in this Protestant fashion in your home, you're sitting in silent, quiet study of it. The Quran is different if you are listening to it being recited to you. And it's different if you're reciting it on your kind of podcast on your phone through your Bluetooth headphones. And it's different if you're hearing it recited to you in a mosque where you're sitting surrounded by people who are all also contemplating the thing that they are hearing, right? So the context and the encounter of the text and where you encounter and how you encounter the text will change your experience of it as well. And that is also true in terms of poetry. Because, as Ernst describes in our textbook, the real subject of poetry is the experience that the poem creates in the reader, and it is part of a literary continuum to which both reader and poet, or poet and reader, continually refer. What Ernst is saying there is that there is an encounter of the poet when you encounter the poetry. You are reading and feeling the presence of the poet through the poem. In addition, the poem speaks to you differently than it might speak to anybody else. And what it does is it creates an experiential encounter with the poem. So, for example, one of my friends converted to Islam um, after he was walking by a mosque and he heard a really, really beautiful call to prayer. And he said that something within him, that random encounter, he was lost in thought, he was trapped, he couldn't think past it. He was walking by the street, he was himself not a Muslim, and he hears something which resonated so deeply in his heart that he felt like it yanked him into the mosque. And then it began a deep love affair, which he still cultivates to this day, and eventually, which culminated in him becoming a Muslim. And it was every bit of that encounter which was significant to him. It was the state of detachment that he was feeling, the dissatisfaction with this life. And he felt like that recitation or the summoning to prayer spoke uniquely and distinctly to him. That it was as if the universe had stopped in that moment to call out to him. And that encounter, that moment of encounter, that's what the possibility is. That's the possibility that's created in every opportunity in which we read or hear or engage with a poem. It's possible, right? It's the realm of infinite possibility that exists in that encounter. That's what we're chasing, for example, with the poem, is that the poem allows us to experience. But and the idea is perhaps that the poet themselves is someone who is further along on the path, or at least has some illumination which they're casting upon our heart. The example, of course, Rumi is perhaps after the Quran the most popular literary kind of figure in the entire Muslim in all Muslim lands. Would probably be Rumi. Um, of course, after the Quran. And as Jami has says, that Rumi's verse is the Quran in Persian, which is borderline blasphemous for those of you that don't hear the implication in that. Um, in addition, to speak to experience, it's the possibility of the connection here on the slide between the poet and the heart of the listener, the connection between the text and its reader. And just keep in mind that the poet themselves is conscious of the fact that the words on the page are not what's important. The words are trying to point to something that is higher or greater, and that the encounter of the words may reach out and touch the heart of the person who is reading it. And so, as long as the person understands that the words themselves are not to be worshipped, but the words are leading you to worship something, something that's pointing to the signs of the divine, then that is what, that's perhaps why one would read Rumi to experience God. Uh, and separate from the Quran, that Rumi is sort of translating into the vernacular, making available to us. And also, Rumi has nominated himself sort of as a pedagogue. He's come in as a teacher. He's trying to re-render the lessons of the Quran into a simple poetic form, which we can engage with and then experience. So this is something that's rather important too, is the experiential nature of this poetry, and it will often be performed. Or the poetry will often be read with musical accompaniment, and we'll have a couple of examples of that just a little bit further down. The other thing that people will notice if you are reading Sufi poetry is that there is an erotics in Sufi poetry. On the left-hand side here, we have an image here of Shah Abbas and his male page here in a relationship of love. And you know, if you're looking at an image like this, it's no surprise that the page's hand is on this long, sort of stiff thing in Shah Abbas's lap, right? Like this, the even the imagery here is playing with the erotics of it. And this in particular will come up with someone like Abu Nuwas, who's going to have poems about love and about erotic and homoerotic encounters. Like, for example, let me give you a poem by Abu Nuwas here. Perfectly innocent symbolism, says Finlay. In the bathhouse, for example, this is by Abu Nuwas. In the bathhouse, the mysteries hidden by trousers are revealed to you. All becomes radiantly manifest. Feast your eyes without restraint. You see handsome buttocks, shapely trim torsos. You hear the guys whispering pious formulas to one another, such as God is great, praise be to God. Ah, what a place of pleasure the bathhouse is, even when the towel bearers come in and spoil the fun a bit. Right? Like that it's hard to see the divine there, right? um, but but the point of a poet like Abu Nuwas is that he himself is writing these poems about erotic encounters in bathhouses. Okay, there's a reason why when the Egyptians release one of the collected versions of Abu Nuwas's poetry in 1932, that there's a mass burning of his books in public as well, because there's a shock of about this material that's in there. But the Sufis, when they read poems like In the Bathhouse, as opposed to only leaving it to be sort of dirty limerick or dirty poetry which you read with one hand, uh, the uh, the Sufis are suggesting that any encounter of love, any description of love, might give us an indication of the relationship between the divine and us. It makes possible the other kinds of love too. Ahmad Ghazali very famously would say once that don't bifurcate love into divine love and earthly love. Don't ask me to write a book on one or the other. There's only love. So the Sufis actually elevate Abu Nawas out of being sort of the poet that you read with one hand into being a mystic, despite the fact that he does not himself ever claim it, right? And he himself is executed also for his drunkenness and bad behavior in general. Um, and here, Karl Ernst will say, many of the attributes of the beloved in these poems are based on the ideals of youthful, manly beauty that arose in the Tureo-Iranian courts of Central Asia. Often descriptions of a moon-like face, which you see indicated here also in the image provided. Skill at polo, long, dark locks of hair, the beginning of a mustache, a tall and slender stature, and a cruel indifference to the suffering of the lover. It was male homoerotic model of love, typified by the tales of Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna and his devoted slave Ayaz, that formed the basis for both courtly and mystical love poetry in Persian tradition. In countless odes and lyrics dedicated to kings and nobles, poets adopted the conventions of treating the object of poetic praise as the beloved itself. So the idea that we elevate any mundane love affair. So Layla and Majnun, for example, not a famous love story. Majnun, in fact, his name means madness. That his love for Layla and the intensity of his desire and his passion for Layla can be translated into the way that the Sufi seeks God, right? And homoerotic love, again, keep in mind that we are dealing with poetry that is being generated in a socially segregated society. So, it would be kind of homonormative encounters would include men with other men. So that would be normal. Is that you would be in spaces with other women, and women would be in spaces with women. And so the kind of the beauty of the youth, of the young male youth, is androgynous on a level. It's fine featured and beautiful like a woman, but in the male form, in the male space, and pouring the wine into the cup. Right. And so that figure becomes extremely erotic. I remember my father once recounted that an Urdu teacher of his uh, there was a question as to whether he was interested in young boys, and when my father raised this concern, he was dismissed and told, that's the nature of poets. Don't stress about it. Poets just are into this kind of beauty. And so, whether we want to read these poems as actually speaking about homosexual desire and homosexual love, uh, there is that element in it. Okay, one should not say that that does not exist there, because it does exist there, but it may be a performative homosexuality or homoerotics, rather than merely being surface level, right? So just keep in mind that all of these poems are going to resonate on different levels with different people. So on the most simple level, the batini level, the like most apparent level, it's going to be a sexual love encounter between two men. And then on a deeper level, one may understand it as the lovers being like Rumi and Shamse Tabriz, that the lovers that are coming together to elevate both their statuses. And then on the ultimate level, one may begin to see it as the encounter between the seeker and the divine, right? All spinning out from what on the page looks very much like homoerotic verse. But this can often get, of course, the Sufis and others in trouble, right? Like, so it's very easy to reject them if you are in the business of punishing homosexuals for whatever reason. You may turn to something like this and say, see, it's right here in the poems that you guys are reading. It's represented right here. And so this is something that corrupts Islam, for example, might be one of those arguments. But it often kind of ignores the deeper meanings and understandings and approaches that might be contained therein. And just in general, homosexuality, one must keep in mind that it does not exist as a separate political identity in the past. Okay, like today, when we have pride marches in Western cities in particular, that did not, your sexual identity was not the basis of your formation of a political identity, right? So today, queer people going back and reading Sufi erotic verse are finding something else in it that was not intended as the kind of script of a political movement, which is not to say that it can't be used that way. It's just it what maybe was not intended for use in that way. Although, can young queer men find deep love and resonance in this stuff? Absolutely. Why not? Right? Would be the response of the Sufi. All right. Um, the other thing is in terms of style and structure. Firstly, we've got the ode, qasida, which is the form of pre-Islamic poetry that may be found, for example, in the hanging odes, the mulqat, which would be a celebration of manliness, Bedouin and Arab heroic culture. In addition, the lyric or the ghazal, and the quatrain, the rubai. And that comes from again the number four in Arabic. And the structure of these poems will often have a repeated line and then a repeated phrase. So A, B, A. And so, from a formal point of view, the only difference between these forms is their length. The quatrain consists of 2 lines or 4 half verses. The lyric is customary 6 to 20 lines, and the ode may be from 25 to several hundred lines in depth. And often, poetry is going to be written in parallel lines in these books of poetry, in the divans, for example. And this last form, the masnavi, is something that's important too, which is it comes from the Bardic Irani tradition, Persianate traditions, such as the Shahnameh, for example, which is going to be about 100,000 lines long. Oh, sorry. 60,000 lines long, and the Mathnavi, for example, by Rumi, is about half that length, so about 30 or 40,000 lines. Um, and again, it's a little bit difficult. Like, so when I just say the Masnavi of Rumi, the Masnavis like weren't a stable text, right? So we'll usually, when there's a translation, they'll refer to which version that they are translating, because these weren't the texts weren't stable in the same way. Because often you'll find, like in the example of Hafez or others, that they would blend in the poetry of other contemporaries without necessarily citing them. Because keep in mind again that our desire today to prevent plagiarism is often based on the idea that you can own an idea, right? And that is something that's very strange historically to humankind. Instead, these poets often did tribute to each other by borrowing each other's verses and phrases and incorporating it into their own texts. And the Masnavi is going to take the form A, B, B, C, C, and we'll give you an example of that in a few slides as well. All right. Any questions at this stage? Because I've covered sort of the formalistic elements, the overall philosophical ideas, and I see that we're right about at an hour. And I thought it'd be best for us to take our short break now. And then we will get into some actual examples of the poetry. And just to reiterate again with the students, that we are going to be going over the assignment for the last little bit of the course as well. And like I said, it's a pretty straightforward assignment. I don't expect you to have a whole developed thesis, but rather to have at this point just picked the figure who you would like to look into a little bit deeper. So let's take our let's take 10 here just to get a cup of tea, a quick run for a bio break, and be back in 10 minutes. Let me pause the recording here and we will see. And just a heads up to those of us who are not watching this live, the YouTube videos, again, we cannot watch them as part of the video taped lecture for copyright purposes, but I will have the links below the video for you. So you can connect. Well, I won't, but the profoundly helpful Jennifer Webb at St. Mary's will be annotating the video with the other YouTube links. So please do look for those. All right, let us start back up. With regards to the Sufi traditions of love, especially as it is expressed in poetry. It's to that which we'll now turn. And as we began rightly so with the saints, we're going to begin again with Rabia al-Basri. And Rabia, just as a quick reminder, is a very, very early mystic. She is renowned because of she embodies an early trope of this style of mystic, the person who renounces the world and worldly pleasures, who is in love with God only for the sake of God, and who disrupts the social norms of her era in a certain way as well. And so Arabia here, and this is the account of Fariduddin Attar in his book on the Awliya, and he describes here, "O God, whatsoever thou hast apportioned to me of worldly things, do thou give that to thy enemies, and whatsoever thou hast apportioned me to the world which is to come, give that to thy friends, for thou suffices me." You alone, right? O God, if I worship thee for fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship thee for hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thy sake alone, or thy own sake, grudge me not thy everlasting beauty. O God, my whole occupation and all my desire in this world of worldly things is to remember thee, and in the world to come, all the things of the world to come is to meet thee. And on my side, as I have stated, now do thou whatever. whatsoever. Um, Rabia here is playing with some of these key themes, the idea of beauty and the God as a lover of beauty, and so the love of beautiful things as the love of God. Here she's also engaging in this tendency to reiterate her world renouncing and the rejection of the worldly and the material. And also, she's rejecting the hypocrisy of those who do the acts of prayer, acts of worship, merely for reward. The idea that they're stamping, but they're punching holes in their Timmy's card until they get the free coffee, right? Like that's the kind of thing that she is cautioning us against. And playing especially with this Quranic referent, that all that will remain will be the face of God. And so why don't we take that kind of declaration in the Quran seriously, or as seriously as one indicating lashings, or as seriously as one indicating the ethics of war? Why don't we take the love of God and the mercy of God to be actionable in our reality as well, right? So Rabia is the prototype upon which we sort of will look at all mystics moving forward. And Bezid Bistami will also have one of his very important poems in which he describes the feeling that when you are thirsty and you drink the entire ocean, but still you crave more. And even that kind of language is going to be showing up in Rumi as well. All right. So here is Rabia. And now let us turn a little bit to Rumi as well. And my hope is that the sense that you're getting is that we have encountered a lot of these figures before in the course of this class, and it's sort of poetry would be the culmination of a lot of these different figures that come together and get tied in this knot. And so Rabia, it makes sense that we talked to her about her in sainthood, and her writings would become part of this corpus of the love traditions in Islam. Similarly, Rumi, and here again we have this very large statue of him, which shows the mystic kind of in a state of ecstasy, perhaps in his spin, and again the open hand to the sky, receiving baraka, receiving the blessing, and the hand pointed towards the ground, distributing it like a love sprinkler, right? um, so uh, when we are going to look at someone like Rumi, Rumi's the main what we have in terms of his verse. We have his kind of Divane Shams Tabrizi, which is his work. Ostensibly dedicated to his teacher Shams, and then also the Mathnavi, which is kind of one of the most popular works of literature in the history of the world. Um, Let me give you an example now of the Song of the Reed. So first, what I'm going to do is we're going to do it in three different ways. Initially, I'm going to play you a clip of someone performing the Song of the Reed, accompanied by a reed flute, which is very traditional in the ways that this is often encountered. Um, so we've got first, and in addition, this person is not themselves Irani, but is from South Asia. And Rumi is not only popular in Iran and in kind of Persian speaking context or Farsi speaking context, but is also extremely popular in South Asia. And in fact, Rumi's impact in South Asia, according to some, such as Karl Ernst, may be, or even Omid Safi, may be greater in South Asia than even in Iran, which also has Hafiz, right? So that's what splits the vote, perhaps, amongst the Iranis. Whereas for South Asia, Rumi is a luminary. Now, let me pause the video here. And just to reiterate for those of you watching after the fact, please link yourself to the video in the links below. So let me pause the recording. I'll play the video for you now. Recording as well. Okay. So what is she saying? These are the opening lines of the Mathnavi. This is the very start, and it begins with the exordium of the Song of the Reed. So let me read you this translation, and then let's get into some of the themes that are discussed. So here we are. Now listen to this reed flute's deep lament about the heartache being apart has meant. Since from the reed bed they uprooted me, my songs expressed in each's human agony, a breast which separation split in two, my songs expressed in each human's agony. Sorry, a breast which is separation is split in two is what I seek to share this pain with you. When kept from their true origin, all yearn for union on the day that they can return. Amongst the crowd alone I mourn my fate. With good and bad I've learned to integrate. That we were friends, each one was satisfied, but none sought out my secrets from inside. My deepest secret in this song I wail, but my eyes and ears can't penetrate the veil. Body and soul are joined to form one whole, but no one is allowed to see my soul. It's fire, not just hot air, the reed flute's cry. If you don't have this fire, then you should die. Love's fire is what makes every reed flute pine. Love's fervor thus lends potency to wine. The reed consoles those forced to be apart. Its notes will lift the veil upon your heart. Where's antidote or poison like its song, or confidant, or one who's pined so long? The reed relates a tortuous path ahead, recalls the love with which Majnun's heart bled. The few who hear the truths the reed has sung have lost their wits so they can speak this tongue. The day is wasted if it is spent in grief, consumed by burning aches without relief. Good times have long passed, but we shouldn't care. When you're with us, our friend beyond compare, while ordinary men on drops can survive. A fish needs oceans daily to survive. The way the ripe must feel, the raw can't tell. My speech must be concise, and so farewell. All right, let's get into it a little bit. So, now, please, let me begin by way of apology. Scholars of Rumi would say that you should spend about 10 years on this opening. Okay. So, uh, how to get into it. So Jawad Madadi, the translation is really beautiful. This is the most recent Oxford translation. Unfortunately, he didn't release a parallel text edition, which is what all scholars love, right, with the Persian on the one side and the English on the other. But this is a very good one. There is a version that has been recently released by Bloomsbury with the Persian and the English side by side, um, but it's very expensive. So we might wait for the paperback edition. But let's have a peek at some of the themes that are going on in this poem. So first, we have this question of separation and return, and again, Rumi is speaking to the separation of us from the divine by the act of thieves. For example, Adam and Eve. Um, and so we are removed from the garden by an act that is not our own, in the same way that the reed is cut from the riverbank without its own agency involved, right? And then how do you make the reed that you have cut from the river into the reed which you will then insert into the flute, into the reed flute? So initially, you have to take it, you have to strip it, you have to heat it, you have to break it in two, and then stretch it through the flute, right? So each of these acts is an act, almost like an alchemical act, is an act of transformation, which renders the thing as it existed separate, the reed on the bank of the river, into something very, very different, right? And in some ways, this is the description of the mystical path as well. But the other thing is that the reed becomes animated by the breath of the person breathing into the flute, right? This is again meant to recall the way that God gives life to Adam by breathing the hu into his body. So, in the same way that the reed becomes animated by the breath of life, the breath of the flute player animates the reed again, right? Even though it's in this state of separation stretched out. In addition, the musical accompaniment, which we saw in the short video there, is an indication also of the way that this would have been encountered. So it wouldn't have just been that you were thinking about the lament of the reed, but you would also be hearing the pathos of the instrument sounding that lament, that long notes, the kind of heart wrenching nature of the music. It's meant to tug at you. And so in the sama, in the Sufi kind of lodge, the flute and the poetry would be together, given to you sort of as one experience, so that multiple senses are being triggered simultaneously in the exploration of this lament, right? In addition, we know that when the reed is talking about the secrets hidden inside, the flute maker knows that the reed has to be transformed through these processes to render it into something which will then be useful in the form of a flute, right? But the reed itself would resist that, would resist those transformations, doesn't want that to necessarily happen to it. And so there's this sense of the pain of the agony of separation, but also the pain of the metamorphosis necessary to render the flute into to render the reed into the instrument. Um, Rumi here elsewhere will say, since the world's remedy is searching for pain and disease, we have cut ourselves off from remedies and are the companions of pain. Because the flute, the reed, we understand the reed as it's stretched and torn and pulled apart to exist in the flute. Its lament for the shore is like our lament for God, right? Would be the way that a Sufi might interpret this as well. The other thing that's relevant here is that it's going to have this inner and outer dimension, the secrets that are revealed on the surface versus those that are revealed when you dig deeper. And again, the poem is meant to be encountered, it's meant to be chewed, it's meant to be thought over, it's meant to be engaged, and you're meant to think on it. Right? So, if you are in a state of longing as a lover for an earthly love, perhaps you would hear that in the lament of the reed, right? That same sense would come over your own heart, right? And in addition, in this poem, we have a little bit of the story of the master and the disciple. The person who is forming the reed into the flute knows the purpose and knows the end, whereas the reed does not want to be changed in through these paths. In addition, it mentions this classical story of Layla and Majnun. So again, Rumi is using earthly love to be a signpost of divine love. And also, he's talking about who can see the nature of the soul. And also, this is going to be quite significant in terms of how the role of the saint operates, right? The saint that can cut through the BS and get us right to the truth, right? And it's just so happens that the very next story in the Mathnavi will be about a king who consults with a saint to save the life of a slave girl of his who's in love with a goldsmith, from Samarkand. Um, so this it's a little bit hard to kind of speak of someone like Rumi or to speak of an individual poem without all of these other little elements, right? The location and how it's performed versus how we might read it on our own, versus the ways that we may read it with someone that we love, or versus the way that we might encounter it again in a Sufi lodge, right? Each of those encounters is going to resonate differently with us. And the ability of the text to speak to us in this deep fashion is something that's quite like, for example, if I was to say, how can this be actionable, right? Like, so could a prince read this and make a decision on this? um, so my feeling is that historically, when we're talking about the ethics of princes, right, like, or the so-called mirror princes literatures that were meant to teach rulers ethics, they often weren't designed only to be lessons in the Machiavellian sense, right? Be brutal, oppress fully. If you're going to do violence so brutally that it suppresses. Or alternatively, in Sun Tzu's Art of War, right? How you behave in certain circumstances, scripts for how you should then behave in your life. But rather, think of these as Zen koans, almost like puzzles which unfold the more time you spend with them. The deeper you are in contemplation with the text, the more the text will begin to resonate with you. And one must remember that in a majority of the Muslim world, poetry, especially kind of in the post nationalist phase, is something that nearly all children learn in school. And nearly all children can recall at the drop of a hat their local poet. So, Iqbal, for example, the prayer for children, almost every child in Pakistan will know that off the top of their head. Or alternatively, certain lines from Hafez will be known by every student in Iran. And so these are kind of inscribed on our heart, and they allow us to encounter the text on a personal level, the same way that you would with the Quran. If you have inscribed it on your heart, you will encounter it everywhere in the world around you. And in fact, princes in India were known to consult books of poetry even for how to make decisions in politics. So, an example might also be that if you are a prince and you are ruling over a state and you are reading Rumi, you may find resonances in the ways that Rumi is describing the behavior of princes, perhaps in his text too. There's a comment here by Devin. It's impressive that they got the translation to rhyme, but it would likely affect the meaning of the translation in order to fit the rhyming patterns. Definitely. And Carl Ernst at the beginning of our chapter has a bit of a discussion about what you do when you translate, right? So, do you translate it to bring the rhyming over? Because the Masnavi is meant to be in rhyming couplets. So, it would be weird for you to read a version, even in translation of the Masnavi, that wouldn't do that. And translations of the Masnavi into languages like Urdu do that. They bring the rhyming prose over. Now, Urdu borrows an awful lot of words from Arabic and Persian, so it's easier to do than it is to do in English. But my sense is that with what Mujdadi has done here with his translation, is that he has hit a really good balance. Like, I've seen maybe 15 or 16 translations of the Mathnavi, and his seems to kind of nail it. I don't know why, but I get a sense from it. Like, I putting reading and listening to it in Farsi side by side with his, I just feel comfortable that he's kind of got it. Now, this is a little bit different from what Coleman Barks is doing, right? So he is an English poet who's translating Rumi into English and taking more poetic flourish and sort of bleaching out the Quranic references and stuff because he doesn't get them. And this translation is definitely not doing that. And it's also annotated. So if you see something like the mountains will be tossed like cotton, it'll have a citation saying this is referring to the surah about earthquakes. Like, this is what's up here. Okay. And so um, my sense is with Mujaddidi's translation is that of he's put it into verse for us so we can get a feel of the way that Rumi's verse flows, but there definitely will be something lost in translation, no doubt. But does that mean that just listening to it in Farsi will work for us? No, because Rumi does want you to take the meaning as well and bring the meaning to you, right? And so, to my mind, actually, I often think, would Sufis like their verse to be translated into other languages? My suspicion would be yes, because the idea is that the religion of love, or the idea of love flowing through all religion, it would make sense to them that people would encounter it in different languages in different contexts. But what would be key here would be the encounter, would be the resonance that you may feel with it. And if the translation denies your ability to resonate with the text, that would be the failure of the translation. So if there's a resonance that's conceivable here with this kind of translation, maybe it's possible that this is a good one, would be my suspicion. But you make an excellent point, and you of course are familiar with Quranic translation, which it can, like, you can read a translation that's word for word correct, but soulless, right? That it strips out the beauty of the verse in its native Arabic, and that's something that is hard to do, right? To translate the Quran and to retain its beauty is very, very, very difficult. And that's often why I even wish, like, with this gorgeous study Quran that they've put out, I really wish that it was in parallel Arabic text again, because I want to always go back to the original and have it side by side with the translation, as opposed to the translation sitting separate. But I realize it creates a whole bunch of different problems if you have the Arabic in, because then it kind of elevates the status of the text, because now the Arabic Quran is contained in there too, and it's not just a translation. So does it have to sit higher on your bookshelf? Does it have to be sitting and opened on the right kind of platform? Should you not put it on the ground? All of these other rules enter into the equation, right? So that stuff is for concern too. uh, yeah, Finlay, I agree. It's very difficult not to trade, but keep in mind that that at every stage. We are involved in a translation, right? So that's what the Sufis are often saying. Is a Sufi would ask, for example, let's imagine for a second like a Sufi interlocutor, and the idea would be that, does God speak a human language like Arabic, right? Um, and the general sense is that if God isn't meant to have human traits, isn't meant to be classifiable according to human categories, then God has to be translated into a language that makes sense. So the angel Gabriel will bring it from the tablet of eternity and bring it to Muhammad, and then the Quran itself indicates that it is in Arabic so that you may understand, right? Not because that is the speech of God and that is the pure form of the speech of God. So in the way that in Hindu scripture, Sanskrit is the language of the gods and the sound Om is the primordial sound of the universe. Instead, Arabic is the language which it has been translated into the vernacular. So God's speech, the big G God's speech is being narrated into the narrow confines of this language for the purpose of human understanding. And this also fits with the Quranic understanding that each peoples in the world receives their own prophets, right? And this is the prophet that then arrives in Arabia for these peoples at this time. So for the Sufi, there's a sense that there's a translation that has to take place here to make it available to us in Arabic. So the Sufi might be saying, well, I want to go behind that. I want to go to the origin, to the source, and not just have the translation that is there for the understanding, perhaps even of everyday people. I want more. I'm thirsty for more. That's kind of the starting point, right? So there's a sense that there's translation always taking place, because the translation of divine intent into the form of the Quran, and then is the Quran the revealed speech of God, or is the Quran the uncreated speech of God? These are major theological questions in Islam. Um, and so yeah, long and short of it, translation is a really, really difficult task, and I'm so thankful that I myself am not a translator, and that I basically get to critique translators because that's much easier to do than actually translating something yourself. All right. Um, with let's also take a look at a sort of a rhyme, a poem here by Hafez. And Hafez, for many, especially Iranis, is going to be the kind of culmination of Persian poetic forms and Persian literature. And often, if someone is secular, when they get married, they'll have Hafez taking place of the Quran in terms of their marriage ceremonies in secular households as part of the marriage ceremony. So if you've been to an Irani wedding, you might see a sheet laid out on the ground with different little accoutrements, like a mirror and these 7 little objects. And often the Quran will be featured there as well. But instead, Hafiz will be put there if you're dealing with a secular household. And there's ritualized reading of Hafiz on an annual basis as well. But let's see what Hafez has to say here. So this is again from Karl Ernst on page 154. It says here, God Most High, what fortune is mine tonight? For my beloved suddenly came tonight. When I saw his beautiful face, I bowed down. Praise God, for I am blessed tonight. From union with him, the plant of my delight has flowered. From my good luck, I became wealthy tonight. Blood will spell out on the ground, an al-haq, I am the truth. This is halaj, remember. If you put me upon the gallows tonight, the decree of the night of power, Laylat al-Qadr, reaches my grasp from the wakeful signs rising, from the wakeful rising sign tonight. I am resolved that if I die, I shall proclaim my secret from heaven. You are the wealthy one. I have a claim. Give alms, for I have the right tonight. I feel that has will become effaced from the turmoil in my head tonight. So you're seeing here kind of the encounter of God again. Like Hafez is very, very difficult to do in English because you're not going to get just the perfect word in the way that it's going to be used in Farsi. Let me also give you another example, is that often words, singular words, can have multiple meanings. And so there's a lot of playfulness, especially in poetry. Now, that's true also in English, of course, that poets are going to be playful. But let me give you an example. One thing that frustrated the English a great deal when they were dealing with South Asians, was the use of certain words like kal. Kal can mean yesterday and tomorrow. So if you are temporally minded and you want your buses and trains and things to run on time, and someone says kal, you are going to maybe be annoyed because there's this sense that the people who use this language don't necessarily care about yesterday or tomorrow. But what you might discover is if you dig deeper into the word itself has no meaning unless it is contextualized within the conversation. So you can't privilege the individual word, the sole singular lafs. You must look at it in the jumla, in the combined sentence, right? It doesn't make sense isolated on its own. And in the same way, when you read scripture, if you read it in isolation, a singular word, a singular phrase in isolation, it cannot make sense. It has to be put into the context, especially with the earliest forms of the Quran that would have lacked the diacritical marks. So one word could potentially be 3 different words without it. It could be billah, it could be bela, it could be billah. So, how would you distinguish between them without the marks, without the necessary, the kind of marks that tell you what the word is? One possibility, it is all of those words. That is the intent. That the intent is that the word is meant to have a sense of tomorrow, but also retaining the sense of yesterday. So it's a poetic way of talking that doesn't privilege our current modes of structuring time and understanding time, or structuring a relationship and how we are interacting. And here in Hafez, you're seeing the example of how he's incorporating different uh, texts from the history of this divine relationship of love and re-narrating it in different ways. So here he takes Halaj and he puts him into the story by saying Anal Haq. He's referring to the mystical encounter of Muhammad on during the night of power, uh, as an encounter that he is having with his beloved, on the encounter of seeing a beautiful face, right? So these are really extraordinary applications of the prophetic stories, of the stories of the saints that are knit and re-narrated through verse in this form, right? So it is quite sophisticated what the Sufi poet is doing, but keep in mind he's intentionally trying to speak to different populations. So the population that we are, the kind of detached scholar many hundreds of years later, we read his text like we're doing an archaeology of the text, that we start digging into it. Can we find the answers? Can we find the roots? What are the connections? But that's different from the way that someone who might be unhoused in Iran, who sits and listens to Hafiz being recited at a recital, would encounter the text, right? And though An al Haq may mean something very different to him, he may not know about Mansur Halaj, but he knows what it is like to live his truth and be his truth in the world, right? Um, Let me also give you the example of Bulle Shah. So I'll read you a couple and then I'll give you a short performance of him. And then we'll wrap up our section on poetry and have an opportunity to discuss our assignment with the students. All right. So here we have so Bulle Shah, for those of us who may not know him, he's writing mostly in, he's going to be writing in Punjabi, and he's going to be available in Punjabi and in Sindhi. And we're going to see him being rendered into modern forms through the Chishti order in the Qawwali form by someone, by a luminary such as Abida Parveen. So let me give you an example of Abida Parveen performing Bulle Shah. I've shown this in some of my other classes, so please forgive me if you've seen this before, but its beauty is not reduced through repetition. So please check out that video if you didn't get the chance with us here live. But let me give you a couple of other lines by Bulle Shah, and I have him here in an excellent translation by the Murti Classical Library of India. Unfortunately, as opposed to only render, they haven't rendered him in Nastaliq, so we have him here in Hindi as well. Um, as opposed to Urdu. But let's not fault the translator here. So let's look here at this poem. It's labeled here number 16. He says, "The wick of true knowledge is lit like this. For sure, I am no Hindu or Turk. It is the name of love to which I adhere. The lover is conquered by God. The wick of true knowledge is lit like this. See what a clamor the robbers have raised, and how they created birth and death. The fool makes a loud fuss when lost in confusion, which the lover exposes. Bulla, love is something unique. The followers of love are very steadfast. The fool loses his wits for nothing. True communication lies in silence." Here he's referring, now this is something that you're going to see a lot more in Sufi poetry, in the vernacular, in the poetry of someone like Kabir, in the poetry of someone like Bulle Shah. They're often going to be mocking the outward manifestations of religion. So they will say something like the temple, the masjid, all of these things are just outward manifestations of the true reality which is contained within. So when Abida Praveen sings Bulle Shah's lines, Masjid dha de, Mandir dha de. destroy the masjid, destroy the temple, but because God dwells within the heart, it's inscribed on our heart. That's where you seek. The journey to seek God may not necessarily only be an outward seeking in the world, but must be an inward turning as well. Right? There's elsewhere the line is, you've read par hazaron kitabon. You've read 1,000 books, but have you ever looked inside yourself? Right? These are the kinds of ways that the Sufis, especially in the vernacular, will mock the knowledge of scholars, will mock the knowledge of the learned, will chide those of us that are engaged in this critical archaeological digging approach and say, why can't you admit that the first most basic lesson is that you do not understand? And you cannot begin because you don't have the humility to do so. You're not ready to abandon your techniques of knowledge and to learn from this way. Similarly, let me give you one more good line here by Bulleh Shah. And again, this is self-effacement and mocking, which is quite common in these verses. Dunce, my name. Oh, the mullah taught me a lesson, but I could not get it beyond the alif. So I suffered a beating from his slippers. Somehow or other, our eyes met. My girlfriends also got together to beat me, and my father and my mother beat me too. My in laws don't let me in. My grandparents throw me out of their homes, and I have no place in my father's house. When they study the classes, they all heave sighs. Now, unless I study, my teacher will not spare me. Where can I turn? Bulla, what did the Lord do to me? Mind that something does happen to you too, that you will be fair to me. Here he is criticizing these kind of pedagogical methods. He's wondering, what have I learned? What have I learned from these teachers who are forcing me into conformity, forcing me into abuse, compelling me to behave and act in a certain way? When his argument is that the true mystic or the saint begins to see things as they really are. And when you begin to see the world around you as an illusion, why would you continue participating in the illusion? And the danger is that so often, or at least he's arguing in this case, that the conformity that we are beat into and forced to conform to takes us further away from the truth, takes us further away from the love contained within the tradition, and rather forces us instead to become robotic performers of ritual. Elsewhere in his verses, he's going to speak of God as in the following ways. His face is the light. The world is a veil. He is hidden in the veil, casting its hem over his face. But he shows his face to those whom he loves. He only comes to those who are his friends. He reveals his face and then he hides. The world we live in is deceptive. He is beside us, but we cannot find him. He is disguised in everything. Bulla, the real name of Qasr, is fault. It is a place where people cannot speak openly, where the truthful have their necks severed, and where the false have a merry time. Robbers live in the lodge, and thugs live in the temple. The impure live in mosques, but the lovers live their separate lives. So, with that, I'm going to round out the end of our encounter of Sufi poetry. It is, it's to spit into the ocean. It's to give you just the tiniest taste. And I hope that this intrigues you and this compels you to do some more reading in this area. I'm just a little bit sensitive to our time because I promised that we would chat about the assignment with our students. So, for members of the public, thank you for joining us today. And I hope you'll join us again in the next class. We'll continue playing with this. I'll continue pulling out little bits of Bulleh Shah and a few other poets in the future classes. Suffice it to say that we have been introduced to some of the techniques of analysis today that might be relevant to how we begin to approach reading these poems, and also to the importance that these figures play in the cultural lives of Muslims all over the world. And so, were we to be fundamentalists and only focus in on the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet, you would get a stripped down Quran that would lack the flesh and bones that are generated by all of these luminaries throughout the ages. With that said, I'm going to conclude the lecture portion and shift into the portion where I'm going to be helping students with their assignments. Thank you for your time and your attention, and I hope to see you again next week. And I hope for those of you that missed last week's class because I had to cancel owing to an illness in our department, but I'm pleased to say that Dr. Mary Hale is on the mend, and my prayers are that she returns to us soon from the hospital. And those of you that may know her personally, either in courses or as a member of the public, please feel free to send her your best wishes. I'm sure she could use them. Thank you.